The scientific method is a method of investigation involving observation and theory to test scientific hypotheses. This process can be implemented in a very flexible manner, but generally involves the following steps. 1. Observation. 2. Question. 3. Hypothesis and predictions. 4. Experiment. 5. Results. And 6. Conclusion. We will examine a day in the era of the Salem Witch trials as a case study implementing the scientific method. 1. Observation. Although the experimental process begins with a question it is trying to answer, observations about the natural world that make you curious to learn more are necessary to drive you to ask the question in the first place. An observation is an act of recognizing and noting a fact or occurrence. In the case of the Salem Witch trials, in 1692, the early colonial days in New England proved rough for the people inhabiting the city. The rain and harsh winter proved difficult. The land was barren and almost impossible to farm. Any production of crops came from the extremely hard work of its citizens, often from sunrise to way after sunset, and because of this, food was scarce. Citizens' diets were poor and unhealthy at best, causing malnutrition and a lack of important nutrients. Death and disease were common. Families from all social statuses were forced to share crops, pay taxes, and serve in the militia. The town became factionalized by two families, one of which were families of the girls, which accused all of the witches. Villagers of Salem were also extremely religious. One of the reasons the town became so divided is because their taxes and work had no reward of a church. The people of Salem believed in the devil and the concept of good and evil. Because of this, when the girls began to accuse women of witchcraft, the only evidence used was whether a woman had looked at someone who experienced the death of a child or livestock, or passed by their house, and this was evidence enough for the person to be considered a witch. The concept of mass hysteria is where a group of people, many times a large one, experience symptoms that are similar to each other and therefore attribute it to something that it may not actually be caused by. The similar symptoms could be physical or mental. Oftentimes this may cause panic, which gives the name mass hysteria. This table shows many different examples of mass hysteria, demonstrating that it has been a common occurrence in many different cultures. In the Salem case, the concept of mass hysteria can be applied because the girls all exhibited similar physical and mental symptoms, the sensation of pricking, hallucinations, and many other symptoms as well. Because nobody had the knowledge to determine where these symptoms were coming from, one person could easily attribute it to witchcraft, and then the idea would spread, causing no one to think rationally.
Ergot is a toxic fungus which grows on grains, especially in wet and rainy weather. The specific crop in Salem, rye, is especially susceptible to ergot and also grows in the rainy conditions. When ergot grows on rye, a very poisonous effect is reached that cannot be eliminated by cooking. During 1692, the weather in Salem was extremely rainy and the conditions were optimal for rye and ergot to grow together. Ergot poisoning has two types, convulsive and gangrenous. The first affects the central nervous system, causing effects such as seizures, insomnia, and constant hunger that cannot be sustained. The second type affects blood flow, especially to arms, legs, and other extremities. Both of these forms can cause other symptoms that seem a bit mental, including itching, tingling, hallucinations, a messed perception of temperature, and other disturbances. Ergot is known to particularly affect teenage females, and it can also affect farm animals.
The case study begins in the courtroom. This scene has Elizabeth on the stand testifying against Sarah Good. In her testimony, Elizabeth tells the courtroom that she watched Sarah stare at Betty's house one evening. After this evening, Betty's cow and baby both died. Elizabeth believes that the death was caused by Sarah's evil eyes. She continues to tell the courtroom that Sarah makes poisons in her house and uses her spirit to force people to take them. Elizabeth describes an instant when her and her best friend Abby interacted with Sarah. After the testimony, Abby and Elizabeth began to tear and swat at their arms and legs, and eventually they start to convulse. Many of their friends began to experience these symptoms as well, and all the girls collapsed. The village physician, Dr. William Griggs, examined the girls and found only bruised skin. He then concluded the girls were bewitched. Sarah Good is then brought to the stand and questioned. She tells the court she is falsely accused and she does not make poisons. Instead, she makes broths that are intended to help people. Once you have made observations about the world around you, it is time to ask a question in order to narrow down the area of interest you are trying to explore. Observations may also direct you to identify a particular problem that you wish to solve. The question we posed based on our observations of Salem in the courtroom scene was, why did the girls act this way?
A hypothesis is a potential and testable answer to the question or a solution to the problem. The hypothesis can be formed based on previous knowledge of the topic or already existing theories. This explanation leads to predictions, which foretell the outcome of the experiment that would be used to test the hypothesis. It assumes that the hypothesis is correct and explains what you think will happen as a result. Hypothesis: the witches had the power to force the girls to act the way they did. The fungus ergot poisoned the girls and is responsible for the convulsions and behavior the girls exhibited. The population believed they were bewitched, therefore they began to show the symptoms of being bewitched, although they were actually not. Predictions: the accused woman in the courtroom was a witch. The girls were poisoned, and mass hysteria caused large groups to display symptoms of being bewitched. As we mentioned before, a hypothesis needs to be a testable answer to a question, meaning that an experiment will be designed and performed in order to see if the hypothesis was correct, therefore accepted, or incorrect and therefore rejected. Experiments have an independent variable, what is being tested, a variable whose change is not dependent on other variables. A dependent variable, what changes as a result of manipulations of the independent variable, and a control variable, i.e. what is kept constant throughout or not manipulated by the experiment. Note that an experiment may have several different variables of each type at a time, depending on the depth of the experiment. During this step, observations about the experiment are made and data is collected. Data was collected by Nicholas Spanos and Jack Gottlieb during the trials. They collected data of unspecified individuals, age and gender are not clear, who claimed to have been affected by the mysterious ailment, out of the rough population estimate of 215. Those affected were also testifying in the trial. 16 separate symptoms were identified, and it was noted of which subject experienced which symptoms. Therefore, the frequency of each symptom could be found, as well as the frequency of different symptoms in each individual subject. Data on 21 different people was collected, and many of them were relatives, so it can be presumed that they may live in close quarters.
The total amount of data collected as a measure of what has occurred in the experiment known as the results. Such data can be qualitative, observed, or quantitative, numerical. As indicated by the table, the overwhelming symptoms experienced were apparitions, which by modern times would be considered hallucinations. The second most common symptom experienced in 1/3 of subjects was convulsions. All other symptoms were experienced by about 15% or less of all subjects testifying against the accused witch. Only one individual experienced 4 different symptoms, and almost half of all people only experienced one single symptom. It is necessary to analyze the results after they have been compiled in order to ultimately be able to accept or reject the hypothesis and reach a conclusion that may or may not fully answer the question that was posed at the beginning of the process. Here the relationships or trends that are observed in the results are identified and evaluated. This discussion either confirms or rejects the hypothesis and also includes the major conclusions that are drawn from the results. Although a good old-fashioned witch burning sounds like a great time, based on the data collected by Spanos and Gottlieb, and our knowledge of mass hysteria and ergo, we have concluded that the symptoms experienced by the population were due to the ingestion of ergot. Ergot could easily have grown in the optimum climate of Salem during the time of the trials. Also, the symptoms of digesting ergot almost line up perfectly with the symptoms of those affected by witchcraft, including the most popular symptom, hallucinations or apparitions as they call them. The fungus is also very hardy, and much of the simple agricultural diet would have included it, and incorporated it into many of the common dishes. Hysteria, such as witchcraft, could easily be believable and perpetuable. Therefore, it is our conclusion that the town simply got sick from eating the ergot, and the theory of mass hysteria simply perpetuated the easiest conclusion they could think of, witchcraft. Modern science agrees with these claims. In fact, Linda Caparel, a scientist working for Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, is credited with solving the mystery of what exactly happened during the Salem witch trials. Much like we did, she attributed the horrific time to mass hysteria and ergot poisoning. She points out that the physical manifestations of the condition are apparent from the trial records, and that psychological factors gave substance and meaning to these symptoms.